Hello and welcome to Deep Insights on Mining Review Africa. My name is Hlengiwe Motaung. It's exactly 7 weeks until we wrap up the year 2022, and I must say that it's been an eventful one when it comes to the South African mining landscape. So in today's session, we take a look at the top 5 occurrences that stood out in 2022 and how these have and will continue to have an impact on the workers at the helm of production. To help us unpack these is mining and labor analyst Mamokgethi Molopyane, who is the founder of Creative Voodoo Consulting and has worked in the biofuel, forestry, mining, energy, and space industries. Mamokgethi, welcome to Deep Insights and thank you for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes. So now let's get into some of the significant labor-related incidents in the South African mining this year. We'll start with the Sibanye Stillwater 3-month strike. This must have been quite a draining year for workers. How does a lengthy strike affect workers, firstly? And I mean, after work resumed, the company has recently announced that it plans to retrench around 2,000 employees at its Free State and Gauteng operations. The company points fingers at Eskom and its operational challenges. However, unions are saying the company is using retrenchments to settle scores. What do you make of this?
Well, industrial relations between the employer and the employee in the mining industries are always going to be, first of all, conflictual and highly contested and very political. And then by that I mean is I always give it context of the historical role mining played and why even in couple of years after democracy in a democratic South Africa, relations between employer and employee in mining industry are always so full of friction because of the dynamics of the mining industry. So it's not surprising that we saw, but also besides the conflictual nature between employer and employee, the union rivalry adds to the very tense situation in mining, and of course, besides union rivalry, intra-union rivalry also occurs and heightens the tensions as it were. And so it's not surprising that as the year was carrying on, we saw a strike that was happening, that took place, occurred in Sibanye, and we saw that workers, by the way, where usually they would be on opposing side, workers here, I mean, those mine workers represented by the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, and those represented by AMCU, for once agreed or found common ground. Again, this highlights in the South African context how the shifting terrain there's always going to be shifting terrain in issues that are affecting workers, in the sense that one moment unions are rivalries, the next they can find a common ground and work together. So of course that is going to have an impact on how the strike was carried out, and what is perceived by union leaders and ordinary union members as a successful strike often results in an intervention such that the employer eventually concede and either meets the workers' demands halfway or agrees partially to a higher than anticipated agreement on the part of employer. Now, it's always, I emphasize that it must always be noted that we tend to, as South Africans, look at South African mining industry in singular and very inwardly, in the sense that because it has been so contested, full of conflict and very political, we tend to think it's very unique to us. The challenges of workers demanding more wages, demanding inflation-related wages, and demanding what they call what many workers around the world are calling a living wage. but it's not unique to South Africa's alone, and most certainly not limited to South Africa's mining sector, and most certainly if you are going to be breaking it into subsectors, not limited to just the gold sector. But also it occurs at a time when, as we have seen, the social disconnect, and I must emphasize this. So for audience who might be on the corporate side of mining, they might, of course, find it challenging, or even say, but this is not an issue. We do not view it the same. The very wide social disconnect between what the CEO and company executive earns versus what the workers earn, and what the workers are often demanding, can add fuel to the length of the strike, can even be one of the reasons that it drives workers to say the negotiations are falling apart and we will serve the employer with a notice to strike. So that is significant that we contextualize this. As we know, and we have seen, and it has been widely reported about the remuneration and the benefits, what the CEO of Sibanye got at the time, by the way, per financial report, at the time when the company was saying we cannot afford what the workers are demanding, but also at the time when workers were making their wage negotiations, were in the middle of wage negotiations and were making their demands known. So this disconnect, as if it's a warped reality from what the actual ordinary mine worker gets, and what they go through, and the kind of compensation that are associated with corporates, not just in mining alone, but in South Africa, but globally, competitive remunerations for CEOs, and being able to keep them and meet their demands. That disconnect, for as long as we do not address it in the South African mining industry, will always be an issue of contention, and will add probably to the issues around Sibanye. So of course that strike carried on. Workers, as we know, the rules in South Africa, that if you're on strike, no work, no pay applies. But workers will always say what we are giving off, in the sense that what we are losing is far worth sacrificing in the long term. Now, will the retrenchments that are recently announced by the employer be perceived by unions as a way of employer getting back to them? Absolutely. Again, it's not unique to South Africa, and it's not unique to the mining industry. And especially at a time when it is seen as if the geopolitical tensions that have been happening have boosted some of the key sectors in mining, and then we know that gold is regarded as a haven during times of political uncertainty. It basically performs better. So it's not surprising that workers are perceiving this announced retrenchment as an attack on them directly, and this bodes well. This bodes bad for the employer in terms of their relationship with their members. It may be, by the way, that retrenchments were planned, or restructuring the operations were planned, and as such, the low-end workers are the ones that are going to be affected most. But in the context of what has happened, it will always be taken by workers as an assault on engaging with them, but as also as perceived as an employer's nonchalant approach to negotiation, in the sense that it's always going to be a tit for tat. Fine, we don't get what we want, we will concede to some of the demands you're making, but no, this months later down the line, we are going to retrench, because that is how it is playing out. It may not necessarily be so, but that is how it is perceived at eye value, at surface value, that is how it's happening. And of course, we mind you, the company is one of the most diversified companies in the mining industry, and so and its operations in South Africa are some of the oldest operations that it has. So one on the other side can always say, we understand the need for companies to remain globally competitive, to be agile, to adapt to the changes that are occurring quickly. But again, the impact of electricity supply shortages, as the company is mentioning it. Why workers will ask, why must it always affect workers who are the low end of salary scale? And so this really does not bode well in terms of the relationship between Sibanye as the employer and its workers going forward. But then it's still the year still has some time to go, and of course we know that the industry is cyclical. Something can happen that completely changes that. But as it stands now, yes, these retrenchments are always going to be met with skepticism, considering performance, for example, of the company in terms of how it has performed over in the year, but also in terms of the remuneration associated or aligned to executive management versus those of workers.
Now let's move on to health and safety in both workers and mine communities. We know of, we speak of the Jagersfontein tailings dam collapse, which was another crisis that left communities in calamity. And once again, the vulnerable were left stranded. The flood destroyed more than 160 homes, killed at least one person, and hundreds of animals, damaged 26, I think, square kilometers of grazing land. How do you think this was dealt with in your opinion? And is the industry doing enough on environmental justice? And do you think the DMRE has a clear framework on tailings?
Well, it's quite tricky, this one. But one thing that is for sure is that it's not something that happens suddenly and just now. One would think the mine and the company has had warnings and the impact thereof, or what could happen. Was announced to them, or they knew what could happen. So in terms of handling it, I do think it played out absolutely terrible. Even after the incident and the tragedy that has happened, many lives may not have been lost, but in the long term, the impact on not just the environment, but on the livelihoods of the people of Jagersfontein and their lives, because they are completely changed by what has happened, highlights again the importance of not just limiting or simply passing the buck of environmental management and ensuring that monitoring and evaluation of health and safety related issues is left to the social labor plans, but also is left to the Mine and Health and Safety Act. It is quite important in South Africa's context to emphasize health and safety beyond, by the way, what happens inside the mine or underground. As we have seen it now, in that health and safety expands beyond the workplace, but has filtered right through to ordinary South Africans and to communities. And so it must always be tied, as I emphasize in many of my work, that health and safety must be tied not just to the work itself, but must be tied to the area or mine hosting communities, as it were. Now, again, emphasis must be put that where mechanisms meant to contain private practices of that overlook and often underplays the importance of health and safety. By mechanisms, I mean where government as the regulator, as the legislator, is meant to have mechanisms that are important in terms of health and safety, in terms of acid mine drainage, in terms of tailings, in terms of management of toxic waste that is coming out of mines. If there is not clear legislature and there is not clear policy guidelines as to what is meant by that, there's always going to be a room where companies are going to find a way to avoid their responsibility, because there's no clearly defined rules about that. And I do think it's time perhaps for DMR to again hire more people for their health and safety, for mine inspections, for community areas where mine activity are taking place, for inspection, for random inspections at operations, so that such things, such a tragic accident could be prevented,
Yeah.
but also to always be a step ahead in terms of what needs to take place and happen in terms of managing tailings. And I do think the DMR has the capacity through the Geoscience Council to do that.
Yeah.
They have the
Yeah.
capacity to implement that, but somehow there's always a disconnect between
Sure.
what government or the government activities today is their inability to implement, to enforce, and to monitor regularly activities in the mining areas, activity, health and safety related to mines, not just by the way of workers who of underground work, but also related to the environment and managing mines activity in the environment. The DMRE could have done much better, particularly in the sense that together with the Department of Environmental Affairs, they must be clear as to who, for example, is responsible for enforcing legislature and enforcing regulations regarding tailings, regarding acid mine drainage, regarding pollution, regarding environmental crisis, regarding toxic waste that is coming as a result of mining activity. It must always be clear who is responsible for that. And if it is not, it leaves room for it to be avoided and in
Be
a
tossed
way.
around as well.
Yes, yes.
I absolutely agree with you there, Mamokgethi, that the DMRE does have the capacity to kind of outline who's who. So now moving on to new technology in mining. This is a subject that I heard you present on at MENA, and it's a subject that is very controversial among workers. So while tech in mining had always been looming, it's been coming, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this need and for tools that don't need much of human intensity. So it's really something we cannot avoid because we are facing the fourth industrial revolution. We've seen the launch of Spot, the robot that goes into unfamiliar terrain for inspections, virtual reality that allows for remote drilling, as well as drones that are efficient in the exploration process, and many other significant new technologies. So now, how does adjust to accommodate new technology? What is their role, and what is the role of the company? As I can imagine, this will require some effort from both ends. And what are the downsides of not embracing new technology? And where do we see technology in mining within the coming years?
Well, it's there. Look, technology in mining is not unique. I mean, mining went through the phase of automation and went through, mechanization and automation. So it's not new. And it's an industry that has always been, ironically, at the forefront of developing, of innovating. And in its innovation, in fact, it's arguably possibly second only to space in the industry in terms of the technology it innovates. Often it's been said some of the technology it uses because it explores terrains that are unknown, are inspired by technologies that are from the space industry. Having said that, I do not see how modern mining can be carried out without the deployment of new technology. And I say that because of three things. One, to increase throughput or production, and two, to raise safety, which we have just tackled in the previous discussion, and second, and finally, to reduce cost, and all these three, increasing throughput or productivity, raise safety, and reduce cost, all these three ties to the overarching theme why companies are adopting technology to remain globally competitive, because it serves you no value if you are a company producing a particular commodity but you are not globally competitive, but also to access the market much easier. So the acceleration of, for example, the fourth industrial revolution and its accompanying technology, together with the globalization and the diversification of global markets and the access to new markets, means mining industry and companies have to accelerate how they deploy technology and in what sense. But I think one of the key challenges that in the context of South Africa is the execution focus approach. By that I mean the how that technology is deployed and when is it deployed and in what manner was it the approach was taken and how was it introduced to those that are going to be affected. You'd recall that one of the many things new technologies are doing is replacing tasks that seem to be repetitive and very much linear, and it tends to not just replace it, but it tends to compress a couple of tasks and into one task or two tasks, thus reducing the number of occupations that were associated with a particular task. If there were 7 people doing different tasks, new technology is able to compress that into just one task that produces a singular occupation, such that those 6 other people fall away. They are becoming, as the term that is often used is, they become displaced by the adoption of new technologies. I do think the best way for South Africa would be a partnership. And since we are a country that has always liked to have lekgotlas, discussions, indabas, gatherings, I do think in the mining industry, this is crucial for the stakeholders collectively, that the employer and the employee and government find each other in terms of technology collaboration, not necessarily in the sense that as it's technology collaboration in its very literal sense, but technology collaboration in the sense that obviously the employer is the one that, or the mining companies are the one that are investing heavily in the technology, but they always engage workers in terms their workers in terms of the kind of technology they're investing in and why that is necessary, and of course always involved government, because anyway government is the regulator, even if the legislation might be behind it managing new emerging technologies, but must always engage them on that. One of for example, we have seen many companies globally, and I think it's going to filter to South Africa, have adopted deploying new technologies such as blockchain, mostly for provenance and carbon emission tracking. And obviously this ties to a bigger issue, even as we know COP 2017 is currently underway, and it's about the environmental climate change crisis. So minds of the future, one way or the other, in South Africa or in other parts of the world, are going to have to invest in blockchain for platforms that are able to track carbon emissions and so forth, but also that are going to at the same time help improve operations efficiency, logistics, and I think even finance in a way that reduces cost for high value minerals, as it were, right down through to supply chain and ultimately to the end buyer. So this is just to highlight how blockchain is not just limited to one thing, but it is something that can completely change how mining is carried out. And of course, for many in South Africa, of course, that is in the coming years. But now, autonomous trucks that are introduced in autonomous as in driverless, managed remotely, are going to, in the context of South Africa, not only improve worker safety, but are going to increase productivity, because they do not have to have a lunch break. They do not have to have health and safety stoppage issues. and they are always going to be managed remotely. Of course, the cost of investing in them, when you get companies that produces like Caterpillar and Komatsu, is going to be expensive, but
Yeah.
in the long run, so initial takeoff cost for companies is going to be and is expensive, but fast forward 3-4 years later, it has probably paid itself, and at the same time has increased productivity, especially autonomous haul trucks, and you know that is quite important. And that, of course, the technology, this incredible technology that we've spoken of, as I
Yeah.
say, and I emphasize again, how it
Mm.
is deployed and where it is deployed and the engagement associated with it is important, particularly because I come to another issue. It's going to affect labor.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges, not just in South Africa, international labor organizations will show you that many of the reports, the OECD reports, will show you that studies that are about technology impact on labor force will show you that many unions and many workers have struggled to adapt to technology as it comes along and as it changes. So obviously for South Africa, for unions that are have historically contended issues about recognition, safety in the 19th and 20th century, are now going to have to adapt in this 21st century moving forward. It's not just no longer about recognition, health and safety. Workers have rights. It's
Yeah.
now about how do we, as unions, respond to technology that is coming, and workers and its deployment and making a workplace that accommodates both workers and technology, such that man and machine work side by side.
Yeah.
These are some of the issues that unions are going to have to contend with, and not just that, the blockchains and autonomous truck, but robotics and automation too is quite important in the
Yeah.
mining industry. But also it's very important for workers to be able to respond to that. We have seen it, for example, in the manufacturing industry, where it's very prevalent, robotics, such that you'll find that in a plant, in a car producing plant or in any other plant, one section is mostly comprised of robots, and the
Yeah.
other section is comprised of human workers or human labor. And so tied that together, how do they make that work? And these are today's issues that trade unions in the mining industry are going to have to contend with. It goes beyond ideology.
Sure.
I must emphasize that it goes beyond ideology of are we a socialist leaning worker organization? Do we prescribe to the Marxist Leninist, or do we prescribe to worker autonomy, worker control led or worker led idea, or do we prescribe to the egalitarian nature of society? It's really about the here and now, the lived reality of workers as they are experiencing technology at their mines, at their shafts,
That's
where
true. That's true.
must work as they
Mm.
experience technology then and there. How are unions able to respond to that? And if they cannot, one of the challenges is they run the risk of being left far behind, because already unions are 3 or 4 steps behind technology as it's being deployed in industries across, not just in mining, in South Africa particular. So if they are not reimagining themselves as unions that are future looking, forward looking, technology embracing, they run the risk of not just being left behind, but of failing to come up with solutions.
That's right. Just before we close, the just transition. Let's talk about briefly the just transition. We are seeing President Cyril Ramaphosa right now at COP27 cementing some of the investments that the USA, Germany, and other European countries have towards South Africa with regards to decommissioning certain coal power stations. What is your take on that? They promise that the poor and vulnerable will not be left out, but what is the guarantee that they will be taken care of during this process?
Well, it's going to be difficult, really, and again, on the one hand, here it's a crisis. I wouldn't say it's a crisis, but government eventually must come out with a clear position on that, because
Mm-hmm.
we have had previously Minister Mantashe is in a way pro sustaining coal mining, because it continues to perform well, has performed well this year. The coal miners, that is the companies, will tell you CEOs of coal mining companies are some of the happiest people this year because of the crisis, energy crisis in Europe, and how and the Russia-Ukraine issue, and how globally they started to tend towards South Africa, another coal-producing country for coal. So they've performed well. However, also tied to that, to the just transition, is the narrative, and it's always going to be, we must look at the political economy of just transition, but also the political economy of mining and of development, in the sense that, as we have had many in the global south are saying, even at COP17, the burden of this just transition seemed to be heavily reliant on the developing south leaving coal, or life, preparing for life after coal. Yet a developed country used coal extensively and for longer periods to develop to the state that they are in today.
Sure.
And now that they have developed, they're saying developing countries must disregard coal. So again, we must look beyond beyond the headlines, as it were, and say, where does the just transition narrative, who is pushing it, from what angle, and of what benefit will it be to South Africa? Yes, a climate crisis is here, an environment and an ecological crisis is here, and we do not need to be an environmentalist and scholars to acknowledge, as we are seeing it. We are seeing long periods of drought. We are seeing unusual rain patterns. We are seeing so many things globally and even here in South Africa. However, for South Africa's coal production, that has been performing relatively well. And by the way, South Africa continues today relies on coal to generate 92% of our electricity, and roughly, if I'm not wrong, we supply coal to other parts of the continent. So it's a revenue generating and it's an electricity generating at the same time, a commodity. To simply unplug from that, it's not just going to be an easy thing, that because it has been agreed or signed on and discussed at COP17, it has significant implication on workers. As we know, the coal sector might not be the biggest employer subsector in the mining industry, because the biggest is the PGMs, but it employs around 80,000 people.
That's right.
In coal mining, and the state-owned entity Eskom, we know the number of people that it employs for its primarily coal-fired power station. So if we are going to, as South Africa, drive the just transition and position ourselves as a country that is planning a just transition, we must have alternatives to coal, but also we must be able to see how the linkages between what is experienced on the ground, the workers that are in the coal sector, the community as a whole. Of course, we see the effects of pollution in Mpumalanga very clearly, but at the same time, we have to be quite clear. What are the reasons that we as South Africa are preparing for a life after coal, as it were, and calling for this change and supporting the change for just transition? And as in politics or in sociology, often they would ask, just transition for who and under what context and why? Why now just transition? Yes, it's important, but we
it's
must.
important to ask those questions.
Yes, I do think so. Politically and socially, anyway, jobs and job losses that are going to be associated with that, and so to say, what about the skills of coal workers? What happens when we are moving from coal, but also from an economic perspective, the regional economic activity that is associated with coal production
needs to be considered. Yeah.
It absolutely. You look at Mpumalanga, probably income, economic activity income associated with mining. You look at in municipalities like Emalahleni, Steve Tshwete municipality, Govan Beki municipality. You look at the type of subsequent employment created because of coal mine, for example, in the transport sector, in the truck and rail sector. So those are some of the issues that are going to come out very clear, and we must be clear about it as to when we are just transitioning in South Africa, the unintended consequences and the implication of on the transport sector, on other sectors that are product or affected by coal, what is going to happen. Look,
Absolutely. Really, you have said more than a mouthful, but just on a lighter note in closing, what has been your highlight in the 2022 mining year in South Africa? I know mine has been when Anglo was launching its first hydrogen fueled truck. What has been your highlight in mining in 2022 South Africa?
Because there's a sociologist in me, and I am fascinated by the sociology of work.
Yeah.
It is arguably, and I know it's not a big story to many people, but those of us who observe this is quite significant, that we have seen for the first time in a long time, union rivalry put aside at the Sibanye strike, and unions that would otherwise have not agreed on an issue, NUM and AMCU, work together on an issue and tackle it.
To the core,
That for me was is a significant shift in a way that maybe it might reduce the violence associated with union activity among two unions, but also among those areas. But a key issue, but that's one of the highlights that I have seen. And one of the highlights also that I have seen, which is recent based on the work engagements that one has done, is the kind of conversations that are occurring at the union level in terms of how they see technology affecting them, and beginning to tie technology not just to them as mine workers, but tie the effects, the impact of technology to them as part of society. And so that transits work issue, but becomes socioeconomic context, in the sense that now we are beginning to engage. We being workers are beginning to engage, as they say. Now we are beginning to engage on issues that are beyond, that are just not limited, affecting us just as workers, but has the potential to affect us when we have clocked out of work and we are members of society. And the recognition that they are society, I think that has been one of the highlights for me, and also equally so, companies that have tried to recently there were awards about the companies that are some among the best remunerating companies in the country. And I think one or two mining companies was featured there. So it's quite encouraging to see, despite the contested relationship between the employer and employee, there are some companies that are determined, one, to remunerate their employees better, and are committed to, and have done incredible work on their social labor plans, and continue to see South Africa as a critical for their development or growth as company in the mining industry. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was certainly a mouthful, and I really, really commend you for your opinion on how you saw unions coming together to resolve an issue that really affects the livelihoods of people. I read somewhere where you had an interview when I asked you what your favorite quote was, and you said, "To a child learning her letters, each word means standing for something. What do you stand for?" And unquote. But also for us, it's really clear that you stand for human labor rights and a healthy socio-economic ecosystem. And thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Yes, and that's because I love poetry.
Yeah.
That's Jessica Fisher's book in
Yeah,
most
Jessica Fisher.
collection of
Yeah.
poems. Yeah, so yes,
Yeah.
that's
Thank you so
really good.
much for your
Thank you.
time.
Thank you for listening. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to Deep Insights. For more mining news, visit miningreview.com. Until next time, goodbye.